Hi, my name is Charles LaRue, and seeing as in the 21st century, one of the most important parts of being a teacher is using and managing data. I'm going to be talking about how to improve data literacy in the 21st century for the benefit of the student. So, what is data literacy? Well, a data literate teacher, like us, like you and me, is a teacher who knows how to generate, evaluate, and utilize high quality assessments, and actually use them to improve the running of the classroom. So when I say generate, I mean they are able to make good assessments, able to make good tests for other kinds of assignments, and use those to gather data on the students. When I say evaluate, I mean that the teacher knows how to judge the data itself, determine if the data is useful or not. They can utilize the data because they know how to take the data they have and actually make something practical out of it. So take the data that you've gathered in the class and use it and respond to it in order to help things in the classroom. Applying data. That's what we're and high quality assessments means just that you make assessments that are high quality. Moving on. Now in this slideshow, this slideshow is based around talking about the 4 traits of data literate teachers. So what are those traits? A data literate teacher knows what the different types of data are. A data literate teacher is able to knows the difference between the different types of data in the world, and different types of assessments. A data literate teacher knows how to evaluate the accuracy and usefulness of data. So they're able to look at data and to determine if it's good. Is this data that would be productive for me to use in the classroom? Or is there something wrong with how it's gathered? They can utilize the data to make informed and effective decisions in the classroom. So what that means is that they can they can use the data that they've gathered to actually help things in the classroom. And a data literate teacher takes the responsibility for using that data ethically. So moving on, let's go through each of these 4 traits. So the first trait was that a data literate teacher knows what the different kinds of data assessments are. Now there's lots of different kinds of data, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to be talking about the 2 basic kinds of data that you would have in a test. Now the first type is norm-based data. Norm-based data is data that is based on how well a student compares to his or her peers. So if a student does better than most of the other people in the classroom, they'll get a high score. If a student does worse than other people in the classroom, then they'll get a low score. Now, norm-based tests aren't necessarily for the classroom. It's not just based on the peers in the classroom. It might also be based on a larger group. For example, this screenshot right here on our right is an example page from the test that my school uses, the NWEA. Now, important use for this data, or for norm-based data, is for differentiating the classroom, because it's helpful because you want to be able to group students based on their proficiencies. So norm-based tests, if you grade them on that basis, it helps you to group students in appropriate groups, not just in the classroom like groups or projects, But in larger groups, my school actually uses NEWA, the NWEA, to put students into different classes, so that opens a whole different kettle of worms I'm not going to get into. The other type of test, or of data rather, of assessment is a criterion-based assessment. In this assessment, you're actually basing their score around against some other set measure. So usually it's just how many questions did you get right. If you got 95% of the questions right, congratulations, you got 95%. Now, these are a bit harsher and a bit more, but they're also a bit more empirical. Norm-based tests are very much about, like, okay, what group do you belong to? What's the best way for me to tackle this group? Criterion-based assessments are good for determining if the students actually learn the material. So, have they actually passed the class? Okay, moving on. So, how do we evaluate the usefulness of data? Now, this is something that I think is really interesting, not least because I have a scientific background. Now, in teaching, we use two axes to evaluate data. The first is reliability. Reliability is the duplicability of the test. The idea is that if you give the same test to a student, say, a week apart, will the student get the same score each time? If they do get the same score each time, then that test is said to be reliable. In science, we would call this precision. It's the number of decimal points in a measurement. So if we take the measurement to the same thing for the same instrument, how different will our two measurements be? Because you really want them to be the same each time. Now, the best way to have a reliable test is one where all the questions on it are consistent and that it has really clear instructions. The biggest cause, I think, of unreliable tests is just the students not really understanding what you want, or them not understanding what the question is. The point is that if a student gets a question wrong, it should be because they don't know how to do it. It shouldn't be that they're getting it wrong because they're misreading the test. Because an unreliable test is one in which you can't really tell one in which you can't actually really tell. What's the word I'm looking for? You can't really tell. You can't really tell the students' proficiencies, so you get bad data. The other axis is validity, and this is analogous to, in science, the concept of accuracy. That is, how much does your test actually assess the student's ability? So, if you're teaching a student one subject all semester long, say you're teaching them how to add fractions, and on the test you have a bunch of questions about multiplying fractions. Even if you taught them how to do it beforehand, if you have the test that isn't actually testing what you've been teaching them, then you have a test that isn't really all that then you end up with data that just is irrelevant. You want each test to be focused enough so that you can actually, make some useful decisions out of it. So you need to make sure that the material on the test matches what you've actually been teaching the students. Now, in order for a test to be good, in order for you to have good data, it needs to be both valid and reliable. So, just like how in science, a good measurement is one that is precise and one that is accurate. Precision and accuracy, reliability and validity, essentially synonyms. Okay. So, moving on. How do we actually use data? Now, there's lots and lots and lots of ways to use data in the classroom. Really every time you look out at the class, you're gathering data in some way. So really I'm just focusing on, using test scores. Now, the norm-based test can aid in differentiation, like I already said. When you group up students, it's really helpful to be able to group them based in similar skill levels, or at least to have some of that knowledge when you're placing them in groups, because it means that instead, when you differentiate with your students, instead of differentiating with 25 individuals, you can clump them up into different proficiency groups and differentiate to those instead. And as I said earlier, in my school, we place students in entire classes based on their performance in norm-based tests, which is something that can be both very good and very bad. It's really nice to have a class in which everybody has about the same proficiency level. It's really bad if that was based on bad data. If the test that they took was either invalid or unreliable, because then you could have students placed in the wrong class all year long. That actually was a problem for me last year. Criterion-based tests are useful when determining if students have actually learned the material in your class. When it comes down to the wire, when it's time to pass them or fail them, criterion-based tests are really useful for determining that. Now, in either case, you can use these test results, to determine who needs extra help and also who needs to be pushed further. Students who do really, really well on tests, it can tell you that you need to throw other kinds of challenges at them, maybe more practical challenges. Anyway, moving on. Now, a data literate teacher also knows how to use data ethically. This is something that's really important. Now, all student data is confidential. Students have the right to not have other people know what their test scores are. Having that added social pressure of knowing of everybody knowing your score is not good. It's just going to stress people out. Students have the right to determine if they want their scores to be public or not. And that is something that you can't take, and you shouldn't take that away from them by showing data to everyone in the class. Now, I also believe that a test should not be high stakes tests are a bad idea. In science, as this is coming from a scientific background, you don't throw out the textbook based on one result. You don't rewrite physics based on one experiment. You need to if you're going to base someone's grade around tests, you need to give them lots of tests. You need to have lots of data points. And having a small number of high stakes tests means that it's really, really hard for anyone to actually pass. Say that a class is based off of 4 tests. So if someone could go to every test except one and get a perfect score and still get a C. Do the same thing in a class with 20 tests and they have a 95% instead. So you really want to have a large number of. So it's really you really don't want to have a small number of high stakes tests. You want to be able to spread the pressure over a large number of data points. Now the other thing is that tests are inherently limited. There are students who just aren't very good at tests. So you really want to gather information from many sources, not just from tests. But in general, as much as it pains me to say as a scientist, anecdotal evidence is real. Use it. Now, something that I think is important, and I do think is an ethical issue, is that you should show your students their progress and their scores throughout the class, because every student should have the right to keep tabs on their own progress and to be able to defend themselves if they see any holes in their grades. Okay. Now, the conclusion. So, like all powerful tools, well, let me start over. We live in the information age. We live in an age in which the single most powerful thing in our lives is the data around us. It's a very powerful tool. And like all powerful tools, it's dangerous when misused, and it takes training to use. It's no different for using data than it is for using a circular saw. Now, as data literate teachers, it is our job to teach ourselves how to use this data in a knowledgeable, effective, practical, and ethical manner. Anyway, that's it for my video. Here are my references. I did have a not insignificant amount of fun making it, and I hope that you score it well, Professor Pants. Okay, well, now I'm going to see if this recorded properly, and then I'm going to upload it onto YouTube. So, goodbye.